as a whisper. God's voice is as bright as a smile. God's voice is as clear as a teardrop. God's voice makes life worthwhile. God's voice is the love of our children. God's voice is the one to believe. God's voice is the truth that lives in our souls. God's voice is all we need. God's voice is a voice of caring. God's voice lets us see. God's voice is the sound of music. God's voice sets us free. God's voice is the voice of freedom. God's voice is the one we feel. God's voice is the calm in the eye of a storm. God's voice helps us heal. God's voice is inspiration. God's voice is a voice of praise. God's voice is the sound of joy and hope. God's voice lights the way. God's voice is a voice of courage. God's voice makes us strong. God's voice soothes a tortured heart. God's voice lets us go on. God's voice is as warm as a child's embrace. God's voice is a silent prayer. God's voice is a voice of forgiveness. God's voice is always there. God's voice is as deep as a heartache. God's voice says we're never alone. God's voice is a voice of acceptance. God's voice leads us home. God's voice is the sound of glory. God's voice is the light of day. God's voice is the still of a desert night. God's voice gives us faith. God's voice is the voice of freedom. God's voice is the voice of truth. God's voice is as close as we want it to be. God's voice pulls us through. God's voice is the one to talk to. Shines down from above. And most of all, God's voice is at the times when you are all alone and it feels like no one's there, when the odds are stacked against you and no one seems to care, you just might look inside yourself to the sky and softly say a prayer of hope as you stop and close your eyes. Dear God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Oh, my dear God, you guide my life. Baruch atah Adonai, thy will, not mine. When it feels like you've lost everything and daytime looks like night, when your back is up against the wall and there's no clear hope inside, you'll always find an answer. There always is a prayer